Gender Award recipient from the California Women Lawyers in 2018. So next we have Marisol León. Marisol León is a Deputy Attorney General with the Civil Rights Enforcement Section of the California Department of Justice and an adjunct professor here at Oxy. She was the 2018 she received the 2018 Attorney General Award, and her work focuses on criminal and civil litigation surrounding issues of immigrants' rights, consumer protection, conditions of confinement in jails and immigration detention centers, police practices, and Title IX. Professor Leon is a first-generation American and a first-generation student. She graduated cum laude from Yale College and received her master's in urban education with distinction from Loyola Marymount University. She worked abroad with social movements in Brazil and Mexico and taught middle and high school students before attending Berkeley Law School. There, Leon was a Berkeley Distinguished Graduate Fellow and recipient of the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans. She's currently mentoring first-generation students through organizations like the Legal Access Pipeline, the Women's Lawyers Association of Los Angeles, and the Mexican American Bar Association. And our third panelist is Pilar Margarita Hernandez Escontrías, our professor for the Social Justice Bootcamp class. Dr. Hernandez Escontrías is the proud daughter of resilient Chicanx activists raised in Riverside, California. She made it to Princeton University, graduating in 2008. She completed her MPhil at Cambridge University and her MA and PhD in anthropology from Northwestern University. In May of this year, she graduated from UC Irvine School of Law as a public interest scholar. While in law school, Dr. Hernandez Escontrías chaired the Moot Court Board, planned Know Your Rights workshops throughout Orange County, and coordinated legal observing for community activists throughout the National Lawyers Guild. She worked at the immigration clinic, represented clients in asylum hearings and in post-conviction appeals, and clerked at both Orange County Public Defender and the Federal Public Defender's Office Capital Habeas Unit in Phoenix, Arizona. Professor Escontrías has published in the Harvard Latinx Law Review and is completing a manuscript on the racialization of attorney discipline. Professor Escontrías recently began a position as a post-bar law clerk at the LA office of the California Appellate Project, and her research interests lie at the intersection of criminal law, immigration law, social science, and critical race theory. Last but not least, we have Kathleen Kim. Kathleen Kim is the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion and Professor of Law at LMU Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Magazine named her one of Los Angeles' 10 most inspiring women in 2014, and in 2016, the National Jurist selected her as one of 20 law professor leaders in diversity. Professor Kim received her BA in philosophy with high distinction from the University of Michigan and her JD from Stanford Law School. There, she was a Judge Takazugi Public Interest Fellow and an editor for the Stanford Law Review, and an inaugural Immigrants' Rights Teaching Fellow. Professor Kim's work focuses on immigrants' rights in the workplace through a 13th Amendment framework that considers the intersection of race, gender, and class. She launched the first legal services project in the nation focused on the civil rights of immigrant trafficked workers as a Skadden Fellow and staff attorney at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and she is the co-author of the leading casebook on human trafficking. Professor Kim served as the gubernatorial appointee to the first California Department of Justice Alliance to combat trafficking and slavery, and as a Los Angeles Police Commissioner from 2013 to 2016. Professor Kim helped to enact departmental reforms that increased protection of lawyers of Los Angeles immigrant communities and restricted officer use of force. Thank you everyone for your amazing work, and we would now like to start the panel. Audience, please feel free to ask any questions through the Q&A box or the chat. We'll be observing the chat and keeping track of questions that will be answered live, and we'll also save a few questions for the last 10 minutes of the panel. So we'd like to get started by focusing on your undergraduate experience.
Thank you, Mary. So like Mary just said, we're going to be focusing the first set of questions on your undergrad experience. So what I wanted to start off with was what influenced you to become a lawyer? What was kind of the the force behind that. And also I want to start by saying, feel free to not answer a question if you don't want to, or kind of just hop along. We really want this to be a easy flow conversation. And so with that being said, is there anyone in particular that would like to answer this question first?
All right, well, I'll start.
Go ahead, Sandra.
Okay, I went to undergrad a long time ago, but it's still really vivid. I grew up in East LA and went to Garfield High School back in the 80s. And I went to USC right out of high school. And this was in the 80s, so this was a long time ago. USC was really hard for me. It was like a complete different world. I didn't succeed. I ended up dropping out and then eventually transferred to UCLA. When I graduated from UCLA, I started working at a civil rights firm, which was back then called Litt and Stormer. And my sister was one of the partners, paralegals, and she got me a job doing some work there. And I worked on slumlord cases. The firm was representing tenants who lived in really horrible living conditions, and they needed help talking to the tenants because the tenants were mostly Spanish speaking and the attorneys were mostly not. So I went and I saw what a lawsuit could do, how it could impact and change people's lives. And I thought, oh, I want to do that. And so eventually I applied to law school, was accepted, and went to Loyola. That's how I got to becoming a lawyer.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Sounds like a really amazing journey. And like a lot of us, we are trying to pursue that journey. So thanks for sharing. Marisol, would you like to share?
Sure. My path to law school was actually very nonlinear. When I went to college, I thought I was going to be a journalist, and I really wanted to focus on writing about social movements in Latin America, and in particular, campesino movements, because my parents, both of my parents come from campesino families in rural Mexico. So I had a very personal connection to rural workers movements. So that's how I ended up going to Brazil and doing research on the movement of landless rural workers. But when I was there, I did classroom observations at their national school and was really inspired by that, and did a shift and ended up becoming an educator. And I was really bent on being a teacher at my former middle school here in Mid-City, LA, because right after I graduated, it was taken over by the state. And at one point it was considered one of the 13 worst public schools in California. And I loved teaching there. I ended up getting pink slipped and getting laid off because of the budget cuts, and eventually got contacted by a really amazing attorney who filed a lawsuit against the school district. And she asked me to be a teacher declarant in her lawsuit. And similar to Sandra's story, watching her do this work really inspired me to end up going to law school. But I went to law school in my mid-20s, not thinking, growing up, I never thought I would become an attorney. There were no attorneys in my family. So it was, it just happened as a result of getting laid off.
I also want to highlight for everyone out there that, like, oftentimes this is a very uncharted path, right? And so if you asked me in college whether I would have been an attorney, the answer would have been a resounding no, because in the first place, I was shocked that I was at university, right? Because I was not a legacy student. Nobody in my life had even anticipated or thought of going to graduate school or anything like that. So, I think I wanted to be an opera singer, and then I wanted to be an archaeologist, and then I wanted to be a doctor. I started pre-med. So for those of you out there who are free spirits, right, and you think that the law is not for you because the law has been controlled by people who are not free spirits, you absolutely can have a place in here, right? I went to law school in my 30s. I graduated from undergrad. I took a year off. I took voice lessons, applied to graduate programs in voice and in archaeology, decided I got into one, didn't get into the other. And so I went to grad school for that, read an article by a badass feminist archaeologist, emailed her out of nowhere, and she was like, apply to the PhD program, right? So there are a series of events that sometimes you, for the purposes of like applying to law school or applying to teaching jobs or applying to whatever, you have to curate into nice narratives, but oftentimes you go with the wind, right? And I believe that our ancestors take us there. So I went with the wind. I studied, much like Marisol, much like Professor León. I also studied in Latin America. That's where I did my PhD. I studied indigeneity and Blackness and the roles that, the way in which those two communities work together against colonial governance, Spanish colonial governance. And then, you know, I saw how the law had, for my whole life, oppressed my parents. Had oppressed my parents. I had family in jail. I had family who'd been deported. I had a lot of experiences. And this was why I never wanted to become a lawyer. And I decided I would just give it a shot. I applied and said that the reason I was applying was because the law was a tool of oppression. I wanted nothing to do with anyone in the legal profession. And I got accepted to like 3 schools. And they all wanted me because I didn't like the law, right? So I was unapologetically myself as well. And now I'm doing this work and I don't know where the wind will take me. But the point is, if you know that what you want to do is justice and social justice work, there will always be a place for you because we're in serious need of that, right? So don't feel upset or concerned if you don't have the perfectly curated and prepared application for law school. Get mentors. Get those of us, and I'll offer myself as a mentor to anybody who's on this, you know, who's listening in, and I'll put my, or maybe the organizers can put my email address or anyone else who's willing to talk, but we can help you curate that package, right? So a lot of it is about having the pipeline, having the support and mentorship to know how to tell your story, because every story is one that's allowed, right? Your story is just as important as anyone else's who's known since they were 10 that they were going to be a lawyer.
Pilar, I just want to emphasize my agreement and support of everything that Pilar just stated. It really is a circuitous route, and making concrete steps in your own progress towards the professional career you want is a formula and a game that, you know, can be constructed, but your passion is not something that can be acquired. You know, I mean, that's something that, at least for me, I felt like I was born into. And so like my esteemed co-panelists, you know, I grew up in Detroit, where I, you know, spent my entire life and early adulthood until I went to law school. Well, I mean, I taught English in China for a year, and then I went to law school. But growing up in Detroit, when my parents immigrated in 1966, and for those of you who know immigration law, this is the first year after the Immigration and Nationality Act was passed. And so this was the first year that all the laws excluding Asians from migrating into the United States was finally repealed. And they had, you know, lived under Japanese occupation, and then the Korean War, and then martial law, you know, post-Korean War. And they were eager as hell to leave Korea. And this is South Korea. It's a democracy, but it was a republic that was instituted by the military. And so they were very eager to leave the US. They didn't know each other in South Korea. They landed in New York at the same time, and they got married. They happened to meet each other. They got married after 2 months. They moved to Detroit in 1968 because that's the place to be. That was the place to be. It just so happened that, you know, it was a summer of uprisings throughout the nation, including in Detroit, and their own stories are ones that are so intimately connected to experiences of racism and also structural racism in their careers, and its relationship, which it doesn't always have a relationship to xenophobia. And you know, Detroit is a majority Black city, but the white population visibly holds all the power, and through its evolution, you know, and it's become a place that unfortunately has become so disenfranchised and has suffered the consequences of structural racism, most significantly to the Black population. So I went to Michigan, but that was a circuitous path too. I mean, not unlike what Pilar said. The first school I went to, I dropped out of, or I'm Sandra. I think Sandra stated this. I dropped out of, and then took time off, and then went to Michigan, and then moving to California was a decision I made after I decided to pursue law school, and I grew up with a sense of obligation to do justice work, and my parents worked in the mental health care access, and so they'd always done sort of humanitarian work, and I was a child when Vincent Chin, some of you might know, was beaten to death by two white disgruntled auto workers in Detroit during the 80s recession, who perceived him as Japanese and a xenophobic threat to their jobs and their access to money and economic growth, and although they received convictions for murder, basically, they zero jail time. I mean, this is a typical story, I think, especially for the Black community, with this kind of violence that's perpetrated by race animus and with impunity. Yes, so it was an interesting experience that and certainly shaped my views in terms of justice. And while I was in undergrad, I spent a lot of time teaching English to migrant farm workers, and they're in Michigan, the western part of Michigan would have seasonal workers come and work in the agricultural fields, and that was actually my first lens into the concept of social justice work as a lawyer. I really had no idea what that, I could just see the abuses that were taking place and how these workers were treated. That's why when I started applying to law school, and then I'll end this quickly, but just one last anecdote. When I started my career as an immigrants' rights lawyer, I was focused on immigrant forced labor cases. One of the biggest cases at the time, this is in the early 2000s, came out of Michigan, those same fields where I was teaching English. Those workers who were sleeping 12 to a trailer were experiencing forced labor conditions. So that's my undergrad story. Thanks. And a little bit more, sorry.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. They were so powerful. And so from transitioning from undergrad to law school, we had a few questions. So first we wanted to know, as students of color, were there specific barriers that you had to face as a student? And Dylan in the chat also had a question asking, what was your biggest hurdle you had to overcome overall, whether that be in law school or just overall? So feel free to answer.
I'll try to answer two questions in one, which is the biggest hurdle to overcome, and then how can you speak to using the system to challenge, dismantle, protest it. I think the biggest hurdle I've had to overcome, because I come from, all of us come from resilient families and households who've overcome numerous hurdles, right? That in no form or fashion actually match the academic hurdles in some ways that we have overcome. We've had to, our families have dealt with migration, police brutality, a lot of issues that to us are, to me is what sustains me. And that's exactly why I personally, my biggest hurdle has been, how am I comfortable in this space? How can I create a space for myself that is not reinforcing the very violence that's been enacted upon members of my community and people with whom I seek justice, right? It's the whole question of inside outside. Like, do you become part of it, the problem, the system, whatever, or do you try to dismantle it from the outside? And those of you who follow Mother Lord, dismantle the tools you can, or excuse me, dismantle the master's home cannot be done with the master's tools, right? And I think that is a perspective. Nonetheless, all of the panelists and people with lots more experience in the legal world can speak to this much better and more profoundly than I can. We still have people in detention. We still have folks incarcerated. We still have people who don't have their basic constitutional rights met, right? We still have evictions. We still have children taken away from their parents. So how do we address these questions is in part, my biggest hurdle. Like, how do I become part of this system? So I think that is a lifelong question that I will have to answer, and that at every sort of intersection, every moment that I encounter, some institution, like, I'm answering that. So I think prepare yourself in any world you want to enter that will have profound policy changes, policy implications. If you want to go into academia, if you want to do this stuff, you're going to have to confront the reality that you are entering a system that you do want to dismantle. And so you'll never fully be in it, but you have to be, right? So I think that's been my biggest hurdle, is actually being comfortable with myself and presenting myself as I think that I am. I will wear blue lipstick into spaces, right? Like, I may not represent my clients like that, because this has nothing to do with me. My lipstick choice has nothing to do with my client. I mean, it has everything to do with my clients if I'm before a judge who judges my client on the basis of my, choice of makeup. But I think that you will have to face those kinds of questions daily, all the time. And also recognizing your own privileges. So within the racial schema that have come to, that sustained settler colonialism and that continues to this day, I'm white privileged in many ways. So that requires of me a use of that privilege. That's how I navigate it for myself.
Let me just add to that, because there are a lot of hurdles when you're practicing law, when you go to law school, when you go to college. There are tons of hurdles, but I'm gonna add to what you just said, because I think for me, it took a long time for me to love the practice of law, and I don't know that I love it all the time. I certainly don't. But I'm a litigator, so I sue people, I sue companies, I sue companies. And it's not easy. It's, it's adversarial. You're constantly, battling with, I'm a sole proprietor. It's me and my assistant. I'm constantly battling against big firms, big companies with a lot more resources than I have. And for me, what I've always wanted to do throughout my life, really, but especially after going to law school, is to stay true to myself and to do it my way. Like, I don't look like an attorney. I don't usually talk like an attorney. And part of the reason that I started my own office is because I wanted to do it my way. I wanted to represent the clients that I wanted to represent. I wanted to represent them in the way that I know how to represent them. And I wanted to be myself doing that. And I probably don't get all the clients that I possibly could get, because I don't have a fancy law office. I don't usually dress like an attorney. The whole COVID-19 has been, like, in many ways, like, perfect for me. I can wear whatever I want, even when I'm going to court remotely or taking a deposition remotely. But I've always just wanted to stay true to myself and not conform to what people expect an attorney to be and what people expect an attorney of color to be. Not because in part, I guess, because I'm being a rebel, but just because I don't want to be anybody else than myself. And I don't want to have to be a certain way in order to be successful. And I have managed to do that, but it's taken me, but not from the beginning. Because even though I've always worked in civil rights firms, like the first firm that I worked at was a civil rights firm, but it was really white. I always had to kind of manage that. And then when I went to another firm, it was Latino, but it was really male. And then I had to manage that because they had expectations of what a woman's supposed to be. And so when I always say I'm the Goldilocks, because it wasn't quite right at the first one and it wasn't quite right at the second one, but then I started my own office, and that's really when I fell in love with being a lawyer, because I was just able to be myself. And I just think like your career doesn't have to look any particular way. You can do it you can do it and be true to yourself and not fall for like what society expects you to be in any way.
Thank you both. And just to echo what both Sandra and Professor Escontrías have said, there have been constant hurdles, and the hurdles that I've overcome, like Escontrías mentioned, are like pale in comparison to the hurdles my parents had to face, right? Like my mom has a second grade education. She crossed the border 6 months pregnant with me. I can't even conceive of doing that through an underground tunnel, like the courage that takes. My father came to this country 17 years old, started working for food. He joined his brothers who came through the Bracero program, and he didn't know the language. I can't conceive of that. I might have gone to college on a full scholarship across the country, but I knew the language and I could defend myself. And I have the privilege of having been born here. And like Professor Escontrías mentioned, I have light skin privilege as a Mexicana, but that being said, it doesn't take away from how others perceive you in the legal community. And one of the things that I wasn't expecting in law school, particularly at a school like Berkeley, that has the reputation of being, all about activism and social justice and whatnot, that's the undergrad. Law school is very different. And my first year in law school, first semester, I had a professor announce to the class, and now we're gonna read a case about the people that Marisol cares about. And I was just, I was sitting there like, this didn't even happen to me at Yale, which was the space that I expected those kinds of comments to happen. Another professor asked me to go into office hours, which had never happened to me before. I had never been forced into office hours. And he sat me down, and I was the only Latina in this seminar. And he started off by saying, I'm concerned because your entire grade's based on this paper, and I want to make sure you approach it as an academic paper. And I was really confused because at that point I had already been published in a Harvard legal journal. And I'm like, what kinds of assumptions are you making about me as a student right now? Based on what? And so these comments, the way that I was being perceived by professors, and as someone who's an educator, I was so dumbfounded, because my goal is always to make all my students feel safe in my classroom. And the fact that these professors had made these comments to me made me feel so unsafe and silenced. And I went up, I told the dean, and the only option that I was given was, you can tell them or we will tell them. And I didn't want them to just give them a little slap on the wrist because they were tenured. So I actually had a very uncomfortable conversation with one of them. The other one I didn't really even care to address. But anyway, long story short, the other thing that sort of came out of left field to me is that, I grew up in a neighborhood that was very working class, very immigrant. And I expected a lot of the Latinos at Berkeley Law to have that same background. It wasn't the case. A lot of my classmates and colleagues, their parents had been judges, or they had come from very highly educated parents who were guiding them along the way, and I didn't have that. But all of this prepared me for the legal profession. And like Sandra said, she feels like she's Goldilocks. I mean, I feel like when you're working within a system that was never, that never imagined you navigating it, it's gonna feel wrong, at times. And I walked into judges' chambers and they look at me up and down and they're like, you're the deputy AG? Because I don't know who they were expecting to walk in. And I'm in a suit, looking as professional as can be, but they're still looking at me like, what are you doing here? Or people have asked me if my parents are my clients in different spaces, which is ridiculous. But, I think it prepares you. The first time, 6 years ago when I took this job, I was the only Latina in my section. in the entire state of California, which is ridiculous. Luckily, it's changed, but I think it's important, like Sandra said, to really think about why you're doing this, what's inspiring you to do this work. No job is perfect, and all jobs are filled with contradictions. When I was teaching middle school, I would want to bang my head against the wall because there were so many things I couldn't address within the confines of my classroom. As a litigator, you're going to be wanting to rip your hair out all the time because of opposing counsel being disrespectful or filing ridiculous motions because they're being paid crazy money and you're not. Basically, I think it's so important to figure out really why you're doing this, what's motivating you, because money isn't going to be the motivator if you're interested in social justice legal work. I am currently still living with my parents, paying off my debt, and it's not, fancy or whatever, but I love what I do, and I do it because of them, because I see in every single matter that I work on, I see my family, I see my parents, I see my students, I see myself. So I think that, figuring out why you're doing it, staying true to yourself, where you come from, and doing it out of a real place of love and treating others with compassion and humanizing and elevating stories that people ignore is really important.
Thank you so much for that. Before we move on to our Q&A session, we wanted to touch on your practice as being an attorney. And as we stated before, TUPOCC is an organization that we would like to have a radical love ethic within the group, meaning loving ourselves and our peers. And with that, I wanted to know, were there any self-care practices that you all used in order to help with trauma and compassion fatigue?
So if I may, I'll address that question. And as my co-panelists were addressing the last question, I just had a quick couple anecdotes to share, just to both thematically similar, but and then maybe also distinct. But I think that growing up as the only Asian immigrant family in Detroit, or at least we could see a different kind. We had a different kind of perspective into the different layers of racism, structural racism, overt racism, and microaggressions and implicit bias it just gave us a unique perspective, and we always want to be on the right side of that, because we were such major targets of it also. And then, so by the time I went to law school, I felt really unsheltered. I was very unsheltered until I went to Stanford and realized oh my God, I was unsheltered from everything except for law school and the way the law is and the way Stanford is, and so we had a community of, my friends in law school, all the students of color, which was just a small group. And Stanford has very small class size, it's 130 per year. So within that, maybe 15% is students of color. And across that, even numbers, Black, Latinx, Asian. But we were allies, and anytime we went into an interview, anytime we were getting geared up for potential career job opportunity, we'd always tell each other, don't forget to put on the WMC, and that meant white man's confidence. And so and it stuck with me today, and not because it's not a pejorative term. It's just that we all shared a level of insecurity as a result of our backgrounds, and that was the way that we try to support each other. And I think that having that, even if it's a small group, having that kind of support is critical in law school and to make it through law school. It could be even just one person, but that one person is very critical to getting through. And then with respect to your next question, so It's true that, I mean, it's a great question, because it's true that, you know, fresh out of the gates, you know, I was supposed to be implementing this civil litigation project representing human trafficking victims in their lawsuits against traffickers, which I did as a junior lawyer, really not knowing what the hell I was doing. So I you know, had to learn very quickly. And I did, and as a result, I was working all the time, and I, you know, experienced a high threshold of stress. I was, you know, in my late 20s, you know, going on 30, and I hadn't figured it out. Like our co-panel said, I hadn't figured it out yet, and I couldn't figure out the right balance. And you know, I'd rather like my hair fall out, and you know, for no reason except for stress, like. You know, I'd see my family occasionally, they were like, you've lost like 20 pounds or something, you know, like what's going on with you? All your hair is falling out. Like, this isn't worth it. So I really, what troubled me the most was at the time, and you know, I think that legal change is so imperative, and I'm always going to be, you know, both practitioner and academic, and the at the time, you know, not unlike now. I mean, although it's just worse, it's worse now. The last 5 years have been worse. But you know, I was litigating under the George W. Bush administration, and the power of the executive and politics just, you know, pretty much killed every victory that I could make for my client. You know, it just made it so non-gratifying in the end, because of other punitive, either criminal enforcement or immigration enforcement related consequences that my clients might still be susceptible to, even if we received a favorable monetary award, you know? So it got so frustrating, the politics, that it really just lit even a bigger fire underneath me. And I just wanted to try a different approach to enacting systemic change. That's why I went into academia, and it's an enormous privilege when that gives me the ability to figure out work-life balance. And at, you know, 45 years old, I feel like most of the time I do a good job of being aware that if I don't get enough sleep, if I don't get some sunshine, you know, I'm gonna be a shitty lawyer and a shitty administrator and shitty professor, you know, like, I have to do what makes my body work, but not in a mechanized way. We're not machines. You know, we have to be able to be reflective, check in with ourselves, figure out what our needs are, and address them in order to continue to do the work.
So I'll say that I represent workers in discrimination cases, harassment cases, and sometimes it's really heavy, because I represent, for example, women who have been sexually assaulted in the workplace, who have been raped in the workplace. I represent, you know, older workers who are disabled, and who, after dedicating years and years and years to a company, you know, the company just throws them away when they no longer are able to do the work because they have some disability. And, you know, part of the reason that I love what I do is I take my job really seriously, and I understand that for a lot of people, work is a lot. You know, it's how you provide for your family. It's where you spend most of your time. It's what gives you, sometimes, you know, it's how you contribute to the world. And so it can be really, really heavy. And so what I've learned after practicing for more than 20 years is that I have to leave it at the office. You know, I can't bring it home, because it's just too much, you know. And so part of the way that I'm able to like step away and take care and relax my brain is, you see this blanket right here? I crochet. So I made that blanket, and I make a lot of blankets, and that's how that's one of the ways that I'm able to step away from the office and step away from the work for a bit.
Yes. So I'll say I have three kind of pieces maybe of information. The first is know your worth. And as James Baldwin said, for those of you who love James Baldwin, I love James Baldwin. James Baldwin is credited with having said, your crown has already been bought and paid for by your ancestors. All you have to do is wear it. And it's taken me a long time to internalize this. And I think, and I want to link it to Dion, your question about tackling the financial burden of law school. I have limited debt from law school. It's mostly living expenses, and it would not have been that case for me had I not listened to my mother telling me to go to the financial aid office and demand of them, like, go there, amp yourself up, tell them you have all of these qualities and you are the best person to get this full scholarship, right? And so I did. I put my red lipstick on and I just walked on in there with the confidence of that I did not have, right? And so that can happen. You can get, if your financial aid package is limited, go back, because few people will like go back and walk on in with the confidence to, kind of reflect back on what Professor Kim said of the mediocre white male and just say like, these are all the things I offer you. What can you offer me, right? So number one is know your worth. And even then, I'm still paying off loans from undergrad. So I too, like Professor León, am living with my parents for a while. Number two is find your joy. Do you paint? Do you, to Ms. Muñoz's, crocheting? Do you sing? Are you a writer? Find out what really makes you happy and make time for it and insist on it. Yoga, physical fitness, whatever. And then the third thing is create your boundaries, because you will have compassion fatigue. Many of us, right? I have clients who are being charged with sexual assault and I'm a survivor. And so I need to figure out, how am I going to sort of create boundaries between what I'm willing to kind of, open myself up to in that space with that interaction with my client, and how can I see his, her, or their humanity in the midst of sort of feeling like my humanity is implicated in this discussion, right? So you have to find that out for yourself, what your boundaries are, but know your worth, find your joy, and create those boundaries are my 3 pieces of information.
I don't really have anything to add other than like Sandra said, some of the stuff that we work on is really heavy. I've been in 10 different immigration detention centers throughout the state, interviewing folks sometimes while they're in solitary confinement. I had to interview one person through their food port, which was such a horrific, dehumanizing experience. And I've interviewed folks who've lost family to police misconduct. I've engaged with individuals who've lost, whose family members have been deported because of fraudulent notarios. So this is really hard work, right? It's really heavy. And when you come from, families that have experienced all of these things, that makes it that much more difficult. And early on, I decided that even though in my family and my community, talking to a therapist is very stigmatized, that in order to really better take care of myself, I really wanted to talk to a professional, particularly a professional of color, who could help me ensure that I wasn't internalizing these things and that they weren't, showing up in nightmares or, in psychosomatic ways. So I found this really awesome therapist who's an older Black female who has just been my rock through it all. We've cried together in therapy. She's been great. And I would highly recommend people thinking about that. In terms of finding something that you love, I'm an educator first before an attorney. And that's part of the reason why I'm at Oxy. It's the way that I balance out, the heaviness of the work that I do is balanced out by the uplifting, love and joy that I get from my students and their energy. And I know that most people wouldn't get a second job to balance their life out, but that's how I balance out, my mental health and how I address it. And family too, just spending time with my godson, who's the little love of my life, is really important to me. So just really knowing yourself and what centers you, what helps you is really, really important. And I would highlight that you should also have a self-care plan before you even go to law school, because there will be times when you're going to doubt yourself, you're going to want to quit law school, and figuring out, you know, how much sleep you need, how much exercise, what brings you joy is so important, and creating boundaries too, starting to create boundaries from the very beginning.
Thank y'all so much for sharing. It's always great to hear people's way of grounding themselves and being true to themselves. And so with that being said, we have one question in the chat that hasn't been answered. So we want to jump to that. And we're trying to be mindful of time, y'all's time, and as well as attendees. So the question is, do you have advice for navigating elitism and racial microaggressions in law school / law spaces? So I guess if y'all could just touch on, or one of y'all could touch on this, that would be awesome.
I'd love to share a comment. So I'm the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion, and in addition to, you know, structural reforms, transformations in the law school and university-wide at LMU, where we foreground anti-racism and, you know, try to improve our structural diversity and decolonize our education, and all them full faculty commitment to doing so. We just passed unanimously a new learning outcome that promises that JD graduates will understand the law's relationship to systemic inequality, and for one else, you know, we have these mandatory orientation sessions on implicit bias and microaggressions, and there's never enough time, you know, to get, we organize small groups and we have individual facilitators and all of that, but there's never enough time to like really get to a point where we, you know, can share stories and that kind of thing. But I always think it's important. I mean, so long as you don't perceive that you're in physical danger, or I mean, psychological danger is just as bad, but so long as you don't perceive that you're in danger, I think it's important to call out that stuff. I mean, I feel like I was raised to do so, you know, and that's why I shared the little tidbit about sort of this unique childhood experience in Detroit. Or, I mean, you can pick your battles and walk away. But calling it out doesn't mean that you're striking a battle. Calling it out just means that you're smarter than the other person, that you can see them better than they can see themselves. You know, so I don't know that there's any, there's no one way to approach it, you know, and I think psychological experts would agree with me, because I've been in these implicit bias trainings, microaggression trainings with our psychology department, LMU. I think you have to pick your own way to deal with it. But for those of you who feel like you want to address it head on, I don't think there's any reason to not.
I'll just say that till the day I retire, people will always think I'm the court reporter, the interpreter, the client, anything but the attorney. I wrote an article about it 20 years ago, and to this day, that's always going to happen. And a singular incident like that, I mean, you know, you let it roll off your back, but after, you know, when it happens repeatedly all the time, it's exhausting. Really what it is exhausting. And so I always have to tell them I'm not the court reporter, I'm the attorney. And then everybody gets embarrassed, and, you know, but I'm also super passive aggressive. So when things like that happen, I post about it on Facebook and call people out that way.
Yeah, yes to the call out. I would say too, find your people, because you cannot always be the one person. And there are times when an issue is so central to who you are as a person that you cannot adequately address a systemic problem without falling apart, right? Like, feelings are very real. I had for example, I had a situation in law school. I had already graduated, but a professor used the N-word numerous times. She was a white woman, and then just stood her ground, would not stop using it, and kept saying, like, this is a pedagogical choice, right? And for me, I was angered. I was so angry, but it was not, I don't know the violence of what that means in my community, right? So what that meant is that I mobilized the few people who also, like me, had a loud mouth, and we wrote this long paper about pedagogy, and we cited from every possible Black female academic about, you know, how creating a safe space is important. And that was a lot of labor. It was during bar prep. It was a lot of labor. It was a lot of work. But my friends in the BALSA, right, in the Black Law Student Association, had always been there for me. When there was a professor who used the term illegal in class numerous times, illegal, 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 what did they do? They created flyers and posted it on every single professor's wall saying like, these are not words that you use in class. Why? You know, read an article, dumbass, right? I'm sorry, this is being recorded, but it's kind of true. So find your people who are going to be with you in solidarity. And I believe very firmly in solidarity because there are too few of us, and we get too tired. So kind of there is a way in which, you know, we have to pass it off. If you're a singer, you know that you have to take a breath because you can't sustain a note for a long time. So you're part of a chorus and all of you do it together, right? So find your people, and they may not be your own community members. I was not close with a lot of Latinx folks in law school. Most of them wanted to go into big law, and I understand the reasons, right? I'm not judgmental of that, but we didn't have the same social justice journeys. So, you know, sometimes that will be community members from other groups, and you have to like welcome that, and you have to open your arms and heart up, you know, to be able to do that kind of work. But always the reality is, and this is my final thing because I know we're running over, power is precarious. You'll read about this in all of your history books. You'll read about how empires can fall, right? But you don't realize it until you start fighting these systems, and then you're like, oh, if I sort of come forward with and demonstrate and perform a lot of power, people kind of back off a little bit, right? Sometimes like really systemic oppressive structures will double down, but there are ways that you can like dismantle it little by little. And this is a numerous intergenerational struggle, 500 plus years. You're not going to dismantle it on your own. So do your part and recognize that every little piece you're doing does actually create a crack in the ceiling. So no injustice cured is too small.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing our stories. I know our time is up. This 1 hour we had was so powerful, and I hope that this isn't the last time that we are all in a space together. So we'd like to close this meeting by showing our gratitude for the multiple people who had made this event possible. Thank you to our amazing panelists for taking the time and energy out of your busy schedules to speak with us today. Thank you for all the wonderful professors of Social Justice Bootcamp, Professor Malik, Professor Escontrías, and Professor Heldman. We would like to thank Professor Escontrías again for being with us every single step of the way as we formed our club and planned this event. And lastly, thank you all that attended this meeting today. And we are just so excited that we are about to start our formal club meetings next semester. And so we will email every single person who is here for updates, and please feel free to email us at TUPOCC or follow us on Instagram if you have any other questions. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
It was such a pleasure to hear everyone's stories, and thanks to all the students for the great questions and for organizing this. I look forward to crossing paths with all of you very soon. I hope I do. I mean, I'm certain I will. So, I mean, I'm more closely tied than others, but please don't hesitate to keep in touch.
Yeah, definitely contact. I put my email address in the chat if anybody wants to contact me or talk to me. I'm here for everyone.
Thank you.
Got it.
Same here.
Thank
Y'all
you.
know how to find me.
Awesome. So should I end because I'm the host. Should I end it, or is there anything else we need to say?
No, I think we're all set. Thank you so much, everyone.
Good. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, I have something, just a special shout out to Nani, who just got into law school.
Nani, where'd you get into law school?
I got accepted to New England Law in Boston like last week.
Oh,
Congratulations. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Awesome job.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Don't
Bye.
hesitate. Yep.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank you.